Daniel. Okay, let's get it started. I'm so excited for this conversation. Welcome everyone to our Authors on Tap reading series. My name is Javier Ramirez, and together with Kristen Gilbert, run Exile in Bookville, this beautiful space behind us at 410 South Michigan Avenue, Suite 210. We are beyond excited to host Rebecca Giggs and Donna Seaman to help celebrate the paperback release of Fathoms, The World in the Whale, which won the 2021 Andrew Carnegie Medal of Excellence in Nonfiction. More on that later. Rebecca Giggs is an award-winning writer from Perth, Australia. Her work has appeared in Granta, The Atlantic, The New York Times Magazine, Best Australian Essays, Best Australian Science Writing, and other publications. Fathoms is her first book. It was also a finalist for the Penn E.O. Wilson Literary Science Award for 2021, which is no small feat. Donna Seaman is the adults book editor for Booklist, published by the American Library Association, a member of the American Writers Museum Content Leadership Team, and a recipient of the Studs Terkel Humanities Service Award, the James Friend Memorial Award for Literary Criticism, and the Lewis Shores Award for Excellence in Book Reviewing. Her author interviews are reflected in Writers on the Air, Conversations About Books, and she's the author of Identity Unknown, Rediscovering 7 American Women Artists. So there's a bit of a connection between Rebecca, Donna, Fathoms, and myself. Donna and I were judge mates, along with a few other wonderful folks, for the 2021 Carnegie Medals of Excellence for both fiction and nonfiction. I can't speak for Donna, but during our phone chats as a committee, I could not wait to chime in on how wonderful and important Fathoms is, especially during a time of such uncertainty. This book I'll continue to discuss it as a reader for years to come and be proud to sell as a bookseller for as long as I am able. We will have signed copies of Fathoms in store. Visit our website, give us a call, shoot us an email, or click on the respective link below and get a signed copy shipped to your doorstep. Help put our new e-commerce site to work for us. We just had that up and running a few days ago, so please send us an order or two and start your holiday shopping early. Purchase a copy of Fathoms for a loved one. It will be appreciated. If you could, please mute yourselves, but feel free to leave your cameras on. If you have any questions or comments for Rebecca or Donna, feel free to leave them here in the chat or use the raise hand function near the end of the event, and Donna will be happy to call on you. I'm going to get out of the way and thank everyone for joining us and enjoy the conversation. Take it away, Rebecca and Donna. Have a good show.
Thank you so much, Javier. That was a wonderful introduction. Welcome, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here with Rebecca Giggs. As Javier said, we read Fathoms as part of our Carnegie judging. I had actually read it earlier. And I will say that revisiting it, rereading it, I was enthralled all over again and just so richly moved by it intellectually and emotionally. So welcome, Rebecca.
Thank you so much, Donna. That's a very generous introduction as well, Javier. I appreciate it.
We're so happy you're here. I believe you're from Perth in Australia, but you're in Melbourne now.
That's right, yeah. So I'm in Melbourne for the winter. This is the Wurundjeri country within the Kulin Nation. So it's the city originally known as Naarm, but others will know it as Melbourne on the east coast of Australia. So it's a very slate grey morning out there. Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, so we're in Chicago on a warm evening, and I thank you for your acknowledgement. I will say that we're on the ancestral homelands of the Council of Three Fires, the Ojibwe, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi. So with that, let's as a writer, Fathoms, The World in the Whale is a remarkably intricate, accomplished, and richly illuminating work. I hope my signal's okay here. Its facts are matched with deep analysis and personal stories and gorgeous prose. So I'm curious, what brought you to writing? Writing usually begins with a passion for reading, and I wonder if that was the case with you, or if it was your love of nature that brought you to books, or how did that work?
I grew up in Perth, which likes to talk of itself as being the world's most isolated capital city. If you look at the way that development is structured along the the west coast of Australia, there's a very thin strip of arable land where most of the cities are. And then behind you, you have this great plate rock called the Yilgarn Craton, which is a deeply ancient piece of geology. There are rocks there that share birthdays with minerals on the moon. And then on the other side is the deep ocean trenches in the Indian Ocean, the Diamantina Trench, which is this very dark, mysterious place filled with planktonic ooze that's been there since the Jurassic. So I think as a writer, and perhaps, as a person with a natural creative impulse, I frame up my preoccupations between this sort of deep time of the interior and this almost cosmological space of the ocean on the other side. So I think that I always had an environmental sensibility. I actually began as a fiction writer, a short story writer, and I'd been writing, different styles of short stories for a while. And then the Boxing Day tsunami happened. And for me, the beachfront that I grew up with was this place of youthful transgression. It was, it was teenager where you used to go to have a drink or where you would have your first kiss. It was a very physical place, recreational space, healthy, vigorous, democratic. And then after the tsunami, we saw this footage from Aceh and other parts of Indonesia where the beachfront had become this really menacing place that was ruined and was a place of great tragedy. And I remember going down to the West Coast during that period and seeing the water really far out and seeing it more like the seabed partially exposed in a way I'd never seen before. And I think for me that there was something that happened around thinking about the ocean as a place of tragedy and change, not this kind of historical constant. And that probably primed where I went with Fathoms. So I would say as a writer, my impulses are kind of formed by those two factors, the environment at large, but then tragedy more close to home.
It's very interesting that you wrote fiction, because this is a very factually rich book, but it's a narrative. I mean, there's stories within it, and you bring yourself in it and sort of give us a personal view, so that storytelling is so much a part of it. So that's very interesting. I wonder if you would talking about tragedies. There was a tragedy that initiated this book. It's kind of the catalyst. It's what you write about in your prologue. I wonder if you could set that scene for our audience.
Yeah, so some years ago now, a humpback whale beached not far from my home. It wasn't an adult humpback, it was a yearling, which meant that it was about 11, 12 meters long, not fully grown. And though it stranded originally on a sandbar, kind of halfway in the water, halfway out, and we managed to get it back out into the ocean and it swam off for a period of time, it eventually returned and it stranded, this time much higher up the beach. And it seemed that it would just suffer and die there. There was no way to dislodge it from where it had stranded. So I stood down there with the crowd that were drawn to see this whale. People brought their kids, they brought their dogs, they sat around for hours talking and watching. And it really was a wonder. On the east coast of Australia, you often do see whales from the coastline. If you're walking down by Bondi Beach or Tamarama, you see humpbacks on their migration leaping up into the air along the horizon line. But in Western Australia, they tend to stay on the other side of Rottnest Island, beyond view. So people were really excited to have this encounter with this massive animal. And there was an atmosphere, a bit of a macabre carnival in the air. I got talking to people about why they thought whales beach. And at the time I was thinking I'd be writing a short story. So I was there just kind of taking notes and really thinking about, the scene that was before me. People said they understood that some whales beach because they're malnourished, perhaps their mother doesn't feed them well. Others said perhaps they've been chased by sharks, or it might have something to do with plastic pollution. One person even said to me that they understood that whale beachings were connected to falling stars. Although when we started talking in more detail about it, it was hard to understand, was that because they navigate by the stars and become disorientated, or Was the additional light somehow confusing for them? Anyhow, I started with all these different ways of understanding events in the natural world, be they predatory or to do with environmental pollution, or perhaps even kind of cosmological in a way. And yeah, I started on that work. And for a few years, I was kind of toying with it as the premise for a short story. I worked on it a month here, a month there, and then I'd put it away. But it wasn't until some years later, when I read a news report about a second whale beaching that happened in Spain, that I really got started on it as a narrative nonfiction project, because that event kind of provided the second constellation that I could kind of draw between this whale beaching that had happened in Perth, and then this second whale beaching, which was, this animal was dead when it washed up, but it turned out to have all these weird objects inside it. It had consumed a heap of debris from the surface of the ocean. And I was fascinated by that question of people having very grand explanations for the death of a single whale. And yet here was this sort of morally humiliating moment of a whale turning up full of objects that are really familiar to us, bits of an ice cream tub or bits of mattress. There are whales that have died consuming jeans and golf balls. And it was this kind of collision between, the mundane reality of the threats that whales face today and the wonder that we install in this animal that really provided the friction for the book.
Yes, exactly. Hence the world in the whale. A lot of what's in the whale is unfortunately from the human world. There's a short passage where you describe that. I wonder if you want to read that, just to really drive home exactly. Throughout the book, you itemize things that are found in whales. And in this particular passage, it's just, I'll never forget it. So to give people a sample of your prose, perhaps you'll just read that.
Absolutely. So this is about the whale that died on the coast of Spain. It's a sperm whale. So it's the one that you see most often on the cover of Moby Dick, with the big blocky head and that sort of underslung jaw. That was how I first learned about the sperm whale, washed up dead on the Spanish coastline with a greenhouse, an entire greenhouse in its belly. In the flattened greenhouse, which was from a hydroponics business in Almeria, were enclosed tarps, hose pipes and ropes, flower pots, a spray canister, bits of synthetic burlap. It had once sheltered off-season tomatoes that were grown for export to Britain. High winds likely collapsed the structure, bundling it from dry land into the ocean. Flash flooding and storms of eerie, unexpected power were gaining in the region, which is known as the salad bowl of Europe. An inventory of the animal's gut itemized other indigestible objects too. Alarmingly, these were goods of comfort and leisure. In addition to the greenhouse, the sperm whale had swallowed parts of a mattress, a coat hanger, a dishwater plastic pot, and an ice cream tub. Like a chamber furnished for a prophet or a castaway, these stomach contents recalled stories of people surviving inside whales. Old parables that anyone can tell, in which such traces are taken for proof of life. Here, though, the midden amounted to a cause of death. Domestic products were newly dangerous, seen from this angle. The banality of household items belied their potential for a gruesome afterlife. Abandoned fishing gear, such as drift nets and long lines, fish traps and oyster racks, had long been identified as hazards for sea creatures. But whoever guessed that whales could or would eat bits of bedding and kitchenware? When I came across that story and read that scientific report, what startled me more than anything else was that here is this icon of 1980s green devotion, the whole Save the Whales campaign. And it was literally consuming the metaphor that we use to talk about climate crisis, the greenhouse. We speak of the greenhouse effect. And in that moment, I was like, if I were to put that in fiction, it would seem heavy-handed and almost like, overly symbolic. But here it was happening in the real world. And that's the kind of moment that I realized I needed to move into something more like narrative nonfiction.
That is astonishing altogether. And you continue to itemize what's found inside whales throughout the book, and it's just very distressing. Earlier, and so the book, there's two poles, and you keep us on this axis between wonder and despair, I will just say. But also you clarify so many things. Let's talk a little more about pollution. You do write at length about whale hunting, and I want to talk about that a bit. But the real problem, what really drives extinction, is pollution. And there are many facts in this book and I read about this a lot, that really struck me. And I'll start with one that, this is a very beautiful passage. You say that, I think it's the humpback whales have Earth's most colossal lungs, and that they take the planet's deepest breath. I mean, that is so beautiful and resonant. But it's in a paragraph that's telling us that this means that they're breathing in a great amount of toxic particles, that air pollution. That was really striking. And then you explain very clearly what the plastic gyres are in the ocean. As you write in your book, I think a lot of us picture islands of plastic that are floating. But could you talk a little bit about what's really going on in the ocean with plastic?
My goodness, it's such a huge problem. The dimensions of it are almost impossible to wrap your head around. And I think, this was part of the project of the book as well, that many of the environmental crises that we are reckoning with today are taking place on dimensions and scales that are humiliating to the sense of imagination. So, I don't know about you, but when I hear about things like these plastic gyres in the ocean or the ice caps melting, I find it so chilling, but also disembodied. And so in a way, the whale, which is this animal that inherently lives in vastness, it is an animal that migrates from the tropics to the poles. They speak across ocean basins, great lengths. Not only are they physically vast, but they live an extremely long time. Some whales can live up to 200 years old at least. They also have an evolutionary history that runs back 50 million years, much longer than our evolutionary history. So the animal became this amazing Trojan horse for talking about global change and the vastness of that event, because all these huge changes, plastic pollution in its transhemispheric, occurrence, climate change and global pollution in the atmosphere are visited upon the animal's body in really visceral ways. So yes, the lungs. Whales take massive roomfuls of air into themselves. And then because of their unique physiology, when they dive, many species don't hold the air in their lungs, because you can imagine as you go down under pressure, that air is expanding and it can cause kind of barometric traumas inside the animal. So rather than that, they sort of push all the oxygen into their muscles and into their bloodstream, where it's sort of stored in an available form. And that means that they're uniquely predisposed to suffering the impacts of pollutants that they inhale, not just because they take so much in, but because they push that out into other parts of their body. And we see whales that end up with a lot of pollutants from heavy metals that are either run off into the ocean through agricultural runoff or taken in from atmospheric pollutant. That ends up stored in their fat, in their blubber that's around the exterior of the animal. They can in fact end up much more polluted than their surrounding environment, which is such an inversion, I think, of how we understand pollution to work. We ordinarily think of it being, an atmosphere that animals move through, rather than something that gets kind of domesticated to their bodies. The plastic gyres are not like these, I used to have this image that was a bit like the seaweed island in The Life of Pi, the Jan Martel novel, where you would just go out and there would be this sort of flotilla.
There, right.
Exactly. It's much more like confetti. It's finer, It's all the way down in the water column. It's not just on the surface. As it breaks up, and it does break up because of ultraviolet radiation from sunshine is coming down and kind of deteriorating the plastic. It's never really dissolving. It's just getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And yeah, so you kind of have these intensifying regions of plastic, but it's more like weather, you know. So you might get small bits of, you know, if there's been a tsunami or if there's been some kind of extreme weather event, sometimes you do get flotillas of debris on the surface. By and large, the problem is much more invisible. It's much more minute.
Yes, which, you know, is more problematic. In fact, throughout reading Fathoms, I kept thinking about there's so much going on in the oceans environmentally that we can't see, that we don't know about. You know, it's as mysterious as outer space. Most of us cannot get to the depths of the ocean, or we barely see any of it. You know, from ashore, you see the horizon. If you're in a boat, you just see your area. But there's so much going on in there, and you describe a lot of it. And another aspect of it that I think people aren't quite aware of is the degree that noise pollution affects marine animals, especially whales, who, as you say, can sing all around the planet and they echolocate. I wonder if you could talk a little, I mean, we're not just going to dwell on all these bad things, but it's just so interesting to me, the degree of noise underwater that we don't know. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and what it does to whales.
You know, I heard a statistic recently, which I haven't fact checked, but I nonetheless sounds very compelling, that on the average day, only 5 people reside at the average height of the Earth. And that's because they're in deep sea submersibles. So it's like the depth of the ocean is so unfathomed. It is, you know, that what's going on down there is by and large invisible to us. One of the ambitions of the book is really to think through the different senses that animals are furnished with and the different perceptual worlds that they live in, both because that's extremely magical. You know, this is this source of great enchantment, I think, for people who enjoy reading natural history, but also because it might sensitize us to environmental damage in different ways. So if you are an animal that lives in a world that is exquisitely defined by sound, you know, you're in the dark, you don't have landmarks the way we understand landmarks.
Right.
Some of these whales, particularly the beaked whales, live, you know, kilometers underwater where they're hunting. Then you are using sound not just to establish social relationships with other whales, but as a form of biosonar to bounce back off schools of prey. Some whales are even thought to be able to use biosonar to see, not just to form a mental impression. Actually, the word see is slightly, you know, difficult to use in this context. But basically what they do is they bounce these sound waves off one another to see not just the exterior of the other whale, but what's going on inside it. And the theory goes that some whales, that they have strange bumps and crenulations on their skulls, which would seem to make no sense. They're not there to kind of amplify sound. They're not providing any kind of unique protection for the whale's brain. And they're invisible on the exterior of the whale, which has a head like a dolphin, smooth. But if you're bouncing sound waves off one another and you're actually able to see the bones of, you know, your counterpart, it may be that these shapes are operating in the same way as the antlers on reindeer do, as a kind of courtship display, a kind of rivalry. You know, most reindeer are not kind of headbutting each other all the time, but that's actually quite risky. It's kind of like they're a competitive display. How big is your antlers? You know, that's the male that is the sort of alpha male. So these whales may well actually be seeing inside one another. Now, of course, when noise pollution happens, we are effectively reducing the way that they communicate with each other, reducing the way that they sense their world, and also how they hunt as well as predators. So yeah, kind of thinking through the senses of the whale, I hope makes us understand more that sound pollution is disruptive in ways that, you know, we can imagine, but are very different to how it affects us.
And that's very enlightening. And it just, you know, reminds us how important imagination is, and good, clear, compelling science writing, so that we can try and put ourselves inside the bodies of animals and try and experience that, because it's so different from ours. And it explains so much about why animals and we too evolved in sync with the planet. I mean, there's so many subtleties. It's quite remarkable.
Yeah, Lawrence Buell, an American literary critic, has this expression that I quite like. He talks about disciplined extrospection, by which he means not, you know, that there are all these concerns in literature around anthropomorphizing animals and putting a kind of personality into them that speaks to our own cultural values, to our own polities, to you know, turning them into nursery rhyme animals. They're all Wind in the Willows characters. But for Buell, he talks about, you know, if you do have a scientific literacy, then you may be able to sort of extrospect as opposed to introspect into the animal and better understand its reality. Now, of course, that's always conjecture. And I do think in this book, there's this irresolvable tension between wanting to understand how change that's been instigated by human beings in the world registers inside animals and changes their social lives, changes their bodily lives. But at the same time, knowing that, you know, that is inherently an act with a colonial history, you know, going inside the animal, sort of trying to understand its sensory world has been a sort of imperialist act in many cases, and that it can be quite problematic because it, you know, you can never really escape your own human framing, your own human language, your own human mind. So it's sort of, you know, I do tussle with these two tensions in the book. And I think there's an obligation to understand the lived reality of other species, but also there have to be limits as well.
It's just fascinating, really fascinating. And it makes me think back, you know, to the early days of humans and whales. And we have an audience member who asked a question, which I've also thought about. Daniel Krause, who I believe I know, says, some whales are so huge and unfathomable. Has there ever been a culture that has considered them godlike?
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of First Nations, you know, attachments to whales of differing kinds. Godlike is, I mean, certainly that language is animated in the New Age movement. So there were periods in the 1980s, 1990s where, you know, you had spiritualists writing about whales as this sort of, you know, pure mentality in the ocean, you know, that they had a kind of way of thinking and communicating that was unorientated to things, objects, and also less hierarchical and therefore should be idolized.
Right.
And yeah, there were different kinds of threads to that, but that certainly kind of is present in, for example, Heathcote Williams writing Whale Nation, that has a little of that, a touch of that. And yeah, I mean, I think certainly in Australia, the differing Indigenous peoples have differing whale stories, differing attachments to whales as kin and ancestors, not kind of in the way that we understand, you know, a cultural Western understanding of godlike, but certainly within their spiritual dimensions of the world. So yeah, there are all kinds of interesting whale cults as well up in New York communities.
So they were held as sacred. And you know, and you begin early in the book, you describe a petroglyph, an enormous petroglyph of a whale, which made me think that our ancestors, if not worshipped, certainly admired and were in awe of them.
Yes. So a petroglyph is a, if you imagine a calligraphic outline of a whale, so really kind of reduced to its essentials. And it's an engraving, it's a sculpture in a way. It's an engraving into a rock face that's fingertip depth, but would have been inscribed iteratively again and again each season. So one can imagine people going back, you know, at the time that whales are migrating along the coastline and enacting ceremony where that engraving would be re-etched, people walking around again and again with stone tools or with sticks. So yeah, I mean, there are differing understandings of what the petroglyphs were for. There are ideas of them being what are known as increased sites, where if you, because there's not just whales, there's also fish and kangaroos and other Australian fauna. An increased site was a place where you ceremonially called to the animal and that you were hunting. So you were trying to increase the number of animals in that area. But there are also extant cultural protocols around that knowledge. And as an Australian of settler descent, there's a way in which that knowledge is, you know, respectfully unavailable to me. So I can kind of walk up to the edge of that and tell you that there are deep spiritual understandings about the connection between people and whales in Australian Indigenous culture. But I can't fully tell you what they are, both because I lack the language to understand that, and also it's not my place to know those stories. So yeah, it's deeply fascinating, and they're great. In Sydney, there are petroglyphs that appear, you know, they're on the edge of golf courses. Sometimes people find them on their driveways. There are stories about people even discovering them in the foundations of their houses. So they're kind of all in the urban area. They're not sort of out in national parks. They're in people's back gardens.
That's well, because everything is all connected. It's all of a piece, and there are no real boundaries in nature. We like to pretend that there are, but there are not. So this makes me think too about, of course, you're talking about the idea of ritual and, you know, and trying to summon animals. And, you know, the fact that people needed to hunt to survive, that hunting was, you know, part of life. And it was an exchange, you know, my understanding also as an outsider to read about this. And I'm more familiar with the Inuit and of the, you know, in the Alaskan and Arctic cultures than in Australia. But you do talk a lot about the industrialization of hunting. And I think that's something that we need to talk about. It's fascinating and horrifying. And it kind of leads up to the Save the Whales movement, which your take on is very striking to me. But let's talk about the increase in whale hunting and the products. I mean, why the Western civilization hunted whales? It was not to eat and to survive necessarily. It was for energy and just stuff.
Yeah. So in the 19th century, you know, the thing that most surprised me about learning about this passage in history is that, well, two things really. One is that I didn't fully understand the way in which whale oil as a global extractive industry really changed the context of production in the 19th century. So whale oil is this lubricant that goes into textile factories, metalwork factories, tanneries. It's used in machinery. It's also this amazing illuminant. So it becomes candles and other lighting, like sort of in the fashion of a kerosene lamp, that extends trading hours and factory hours well into the nighttime, where before they would have had to be finished with natural daytime. So whale oil is there at the beginning of automation, when we replace human labor with machines, and it's there in the kind of like move towards a 24-hour global commerce, global industry, because it's extending the lighter hours into the evening. But I had thought that had all gone the way of like Victorian seances and smelling salts, and, you know, like the whaling was done with at the end of the 19th century. I was amazed to learn that actually there's this massive uptick in the 20th century. And where in the 1900s, we took, in the 19th century, we took something like 236,000 whales out of the ocean and processed them for their blubber and fat. In the 20th century, we in fact took something in the order of 2 to 3 million animals. Ships got faster to chase bigger whales than they ever could before, which opened up populations of whales in the Southern Ocean, the polar oceans that weren't available to hunters beforehand. We started taking blue whales that we didn't take before. And the products that they went into got stranger yet. So we saw them get integrated into the working class diet in the form of margarine and soap as well. Yeah, margarine. But they even ended up that a very small fraction of whale oil became used in the space race, because you can imagine a whale is an animal that lives in extreme temperature, in extreme pressure. So a sperm whale might dive down into the deep, deep dark. It's freezing down there under great pressure to hunt squid, which means that its blubber, when it's rendered, that oil is really great under pressure and temperature extremes.
Wow.
Perfect for putting on missiles, perfect for putting on satellites that are going to go out into outer space. And there are small amounts of whale oil that we use to lubricate the shutters of cameras on satellites. Mostly, though, that was a bit of an ad campaign. Associating whale oil with the space race allowed those advocates for whale oil, the people who had intractabilities because they've invested in that infrastructure to perpetuate the process of gathering whales. We really didn't get a change in whaling until whales were highly imperiled. They were really on the edge of extinction. Whole populations had been decimated. We didn't see species go extinct, but we saw what we call defaunation, so mass removal of biomass of these animals. Just to take the east coast of Australia for an example, the humpback whale population, which is now at about 28,000 animals coming up and down the coast each year, there's a point where it might have been as low as 250. So this is just, immense, and also in the Antarctic as well. So yeah, we don't start to see a movement away from that until you got political change, until you got the conservation movements, until you got this kind of globalized environmental citizenry active on the subject of save the whales. The invisible hand of the market didn't move this issue on. It required advocacy.
That's a really important lesson for us now, I would say.
Yeah.
I was very touched by your revisiting the Save the Whales movement, which I was around a kid, but I remember, and it was greatly inspired by the discovery of whale songs. The albums came out, and there was a symphony. I can't think of the composer's name, Johannes, who wrote a piece of music incorporating whale songs, and this made them seem, not only large and unfathomable, but emotional. And they were artists, they were songwriters, and people, I think, responded very much to that. And also, that was around. Earth Day was founded, I think, in 1970, 69, something like that. So talk a little more about how that's, and there was, you talk at one point about like whale tchotchkes, little products, and whale t-shirts. I think there was a ton of that stuff back then.
Yeah. Whales became a category of kitsch,
Right.
I do remember this. I was born in the 1980s, and I do have the memory of the bumper stickers that used to say Save the Whales. I'm pretty sure I had a t-shirt as well. Yeah, I think of the Save the Whales campaign less as an animal welfare campaign and more to do with the emerging understanding of environmental problems as being cross-border problems. So you've got to think about, Chernobyl, the way in which, a disaster in one country could have radiation effects across borders in other parts of Europe, Things like acid rain, where you had, emissions from factories in one country falling as forest destroying acid rain in other countries. So there was an increasing sense that national governments were not sufficient to really grapple with the cross-border effects of environmental change. And whales really were an opportunity to have a globalized zoological disaster, you know, like that was the story around the death of whales, because they were beloved by many but belonging to no nation. They were a part of the international heritage of the earth. And I think, you know, the people came to want to protect whales, not just because they didn't want to see the planet denuded of its largest animals and their children grow up in a world without them, but because whales were kind of this storehouse of emotions that were associated with meeting nature on its most expansive dimensions. Emotions like awe, emotions like the strange wonderment of seeing an animal that we believe to be social and personable and have a language. The charisma of the whale really arises from this moment when whales are imperiled.
You write really insightfully about that idea of animal charisma. And, you know, I was thinking and reading your book too about the big cats, you know, people are, and elephants, and people are moved by those animals. And of course, they're all in terrible peril, and their populations are shrinking so much. But we also have so many other issues, extinctions happening on the tiny, tiny scale, the pollinators. You write about krill in your book, that what whales eat, that are tiny, 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 tiny little creatures. So that, you know, we sort of chase after the big majestic thing or something that we think is cute, and then we ignore so much else in nature that is so much important. So I think it complicates the conservation movement. And so you have these kind of totem animals, which everyone cares about, which are very useful because they're part of symbiotic relationships that we're usually not aware of. But I think...
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you.
No, please go ahead.
I do think that this is going to increasingly be, you know, the more we understand the ecological function of animals, the more that's going to be a grounds for conservation efforts. I think that we are moving away from an era of investment in, you know, charismatic species and more towards understanding protecting animals because they are habitat engineers, or because they're, you know, they provide pathways for nutrients to move from one kind of habitat to another kind of habitat. There are these sort of emerging trends around, for example, trying to protect migrations of animals, not just populations of animals statically in the environment. And I think that that's going to be, yeah, that's a real growth kind of area of the conservation movement.
That's a really good point. And I'm seeing that too. And certainly, you know, you have these corridors that are being established, you know, and even like bridges over highway, you know, this understanding that animals are on the move and that migration is part of the whole cycle of life on our planet and how precious that is.
Yeah.
Yes. There's another really striking part in your book that I found startling. You talked about the impact of smartphones and social media on wildlife. I mean, a person might think, well, sharing photographs of beautiful places will make us care about them and want to preserve them more, but you have a different perspective on that.
Yeah, so part of the intent in writing that chapter, which is about animal charisma and the digital environment, was that when I read in this genre, natural history, and particularly sort of environmentally conscious natural history, I often see this sort of trope of the individual going out and having this sort of ecstatic encounter with wilderness. And it is, you know, it comes from a tradition in masculinist, adventuring, able-bodied writing. And I'd been thinking for quite a while that I wanted to write something about what happens when we experience nature collectively. What is it to experience nature as a crowd? And I was interested in some emerging research that showed that, you know, increasingly lonely sites of natural wonder are being flooded by people who are bringing smartphones into those environments. And in many cases, taking images that are intended to show themselves alone, but provide a kind of social grist between them and their following online. Now, I'm not, down on the social media world. I'm a part of the social media world as well. And I understand the appetite for those images. I understand the calming effect that it can have to kind of peruse your Instagram feed full of beautiful mountaintops and gorgeous rivers. But I do see that it has a darker edge when it comes to animals, because we feel like we need to get very close to animals. We feel like we need to have a personalized encounter with an individual animal where it sort of orientates itself to us, and expresses some kind of, identification of us as important, or some sort of emotional connection. And that can lead to things like this tragedy that took place on the beach in Santa Teresita in Argentina, where a young dolphin had stranded and it was passed around through a crowd looking to take photos with it. And in the course, that animal became increasingly dehydrated and died. So here are these people taking selfies, and well, I guess, at the end of the day, I wanted to understand that grief and understand that feeling like there's no protocol to mourn the natural world in this moment, whether that's an individual dolphin or whether that's polluted environments and the disappearance of worlds that we were attached to in childhood. And in lacking that kind of protocol or the psychopathology that's unique to that, we do aberrant things like the dolphin selfie is kind of comes out of that. And I didn't want to treat those people as being I understand that impulse. The cuteness impulse is incredibly strong. Don't you want to pat a dolphin? So really wrestling with the idea of charisma and experiencing nature as a crowd was, I hope, to my mind, was also a contribution to trying to change the genre a little bit and move towards something that isn't just about going out into the forest, but actually thinking about the relationship between cultural forms and the wild, so to speak.
Yes, as someone who's been reading traditional nature writing and new nature writing for a long time, I really appreciate that perspective, and it's absolutely crucial and deeply helpful, especially now as we're all watching climate change destroy forests and flood towns on our screens. It's all being brought home to us with tremendous immediacy. So that's that's the useful side of all our social media and digitization, but also to understand that we don't have to insert it's always, I always interested in people that say, you don't have to go to these places. You can know that they exist and treasure them from a distance and let them stay pristine. Or
you can understand, I've just finished reading Rob Dunn's new book, which is called, oh my goodness, The Biology of the Future. It's coming out in a couple of months' time. But he points out that there's all this zoology that's in the house, the zoology of the millipedes and the ants and the house mice and the house flies. And this is a place where evolution is taking place too. We're not separated from nature in the spaces we live in, our cities. Right. And sort of having a sense of urban nature's response to us, the human animal, and and at the same time keeping in mind that withdrawing from the natural world is not preventing harm as well. We're now seeing globalized effects like climate change, temperature change, that touch upon even places we never go. So it's sort of holding these two dualities where we're everywhere at once, and also nature is intimately bound up with our bodies and our home spaces as well.
And that's exactly right. Urban nature, it's always been there, and animals adapt to us and we adapt to them. But during the pandemic, and I wanted to ask you if these lockdowns have changed your perception of anything, but certainly while we were all inside and streets were emptier and things were quieter, we saw a lot of wildlife in the cities. Many animals that I guess are always among us, but we don't notice, were able to come out and be present. And it was a very striking reminder that we all live together. And, some of these like raccoons or deer or possums or whatever, but also, all the insects we forget about. And so I wonder if how the pandemic has influenced your thinking at all about our relationship with the rest of the living world, including disease.
Yeah, I mean, I was stuck in the UK last year trying to get back to Australia, and definitely I remember one week where everything had kind of culminated, lots of events cancelled, and it was bad time all round. Some friends were sick, but I remember standing on the balcony and seeing these fox cubs playing in the next door neighbor's yard, and the next door neighbors had left and taken their big Labrador with them. So suddenly the foxes had terrain that they didn't normally have, and they were playing, like literally they were picking apples off the tree and then playing with them as though they were tennis balls, dodging one another, picking them up, dropping them. And I could have watched that little playlet for hours. It was a sense of like, here is the trapdoor out of the emergency of the moment, to see nature kind of up close and to be distracted from one's own problems for a period of time. I was really interested in the ways in which we, this recovery narrative that we wanted for ourselves in that moment when everything was kind of, the curve was trending up and everything was looking really dire. We located that recovery narrative in the natural world, and that kind of hashtag nature is healing became this anecdote that we held to children, in this dark time, because what else did we have to offer at the kitchen table at the end of the night? So I do think people became increasingly enchanted with local nature in that moment. More bird watching, more, as you say, people setting up little insect hotels. It was quite magic. But whether that's a sustained basis for people's, whether that gets us anywhere politically, I'm not sure at this point in time. I'm increasingly thinking about pets as well, which is sort of kind of where I'm going with some work in the future, thinking about how our attachment to our domesticated animals reflects like our history with the animal kingdom more broadly. And to see, cities like Paris, where people, if you had a dog, you were allowed to go out and exercise the dog in green space. So people would like daisy chain their walks together, where one person would go walk with their dog and then they'd stop at a neighbor's house, leave the dog with the neighbor, stay in that house, and then the neighbor would take the dog for the walk to somebody else, to somebody else, to somebody else. So the dog is out all day. The dog is having, a wonderful time. Anyhow, it has been a real moment for people thinking about the nature that they value and what those attachments mean to them.
Exactly. I've never seen so many dogs in my neighborhood. I mean, people got dogs because they wanted to be out. I mean, we didn't have restrictions here, but you can't always make yourself go for a walk. You need a mission. So walking a dog became a mission. And I wonder too, what will stay with us and what will kind of evaporate again. I was thinking a lot about how beautifully you write and how involving it is, and thinking about you being a finalist for the Penn E.O. Wilson Literary Science Writing Award. Yes, and of course, you have interesting things to say about Edward O. Wilson's biophilia theory, but he is truly a hero and really supportive of bringing science to people who would not ordinarily read about science. And I wanted to ask you, as a writer who writes about science, do you feel that this genre you're working in is important? Does it affect change, and does that inspire you?
Yes, I do. I think that, Fathoms is a book that's written 2 steps back from any specific activist agenda, in the sense that there's no point in the book at which I say, okay, so you have been moved by this writing to care about the health of the oceans. Here's what you need to do.
Right.
And I didn't want to do that for a couple of different reasons. One of them is that I really believe people need to take a thorough accounting of the networks that they're a part of and the privilege that they have and the resources that are available to them before they become active. Mostly because there's a lot of burnout in that, in volunteering and in the environmental movement more broadly. And I think you only really, if you can work in the service of your talents, your unique talents, whatever they are, according to your own resources and in your place, then you won't burn out. You'll find some way to contribute meaningfully. So if you're someone who's just like a whiz at spreadsheets, then the best thing for you to do is maybe volunteer a half day with an environmental NGO doing the books. It's, if you're someone who's really active and outdoorsy, then maybe picking up some rubbish from the beach is the right move for you. But ultimately, I wanted the book to be a place where people can consolidate their nerve, not so much feel like they're pushed into an agenda. Part of the reason for that is that I think if you write to meet people on the level of their environmental conscience, you'll end up writing quite piously. The emotional temperature of that writing will either be apocalyptic or existential. Like, I'm much more interested in the part of people that stays up late at night watching YouTube videos of weird goblin sharks and like clams that stick out their tongues. Like, I want to meet people on the level of that weird curiosity. It's so strange, I can't look away, and I think that in doing that, you find your way to more people, but also you get under people's skin a little bit more. I always remember there's a very famous Australian writer, Richard Flanagan, who's both a novelist and a nonfiction writer. And he had a wonderful piece about the forestry issue in Tasmania a few years ago. Long form essay in one of our big magazines. And it starts with this image about the forest and how wonderful the forest is before it, the logging companies come through. And it says, here's this mosses and fungi and vines and old growth forest. And of course, there's Tasmania's well-known forest lobster. And then he moves on. And I'm the person who's like, wait up, there's a lobster in the forest? There's like, I can hear the voice of some of my friends being like, why is there, how does a lobster live in the forest? That's where I'm always headed as a writer. I'm going towards that kind of like, but what? And I do think that's, both for me, that's more, that keys into a broader sensibility than a kind of green agenda. But it also points to the ways that we understand the natural world as, not just kind of pious, but kind of thriving and interesting and fun and a source of great curiosity.
That's just right on. That is just marvelous and a really good perspective. I mean, the problem with old-fashioned sort of nature writing was it's very elitist, and it just sort of shut most people out. And this, your approach is real, and it's how we all experience it, and that nature is so dynamic, and that the more we understand that and can see our place in it, the better. We're almost out of time. So our friend Daniel has one more question, which is right on point about weird stuff. He says, I'm fascinated by the whale cemeteries. Were you permitted to see any? And do they bury the whales whole? It would be difficult to conceal a whale cemetery if they were burying giant whales. So
yeah,
tell us.
The whale cemeteries in Australia, if a particularly unique whale beaches or a whale that's died of unknown causes that scientists are quite interested in, they might then take that whale body to a space inside a national park where it will be buried until funding becomes available to do tests on it, or until the whale's body has rotted to the degree that they can take a look at the bones or what have you. They're wrapped up in fishing wire and muslin, and they're buried. There's like a little stake that has a number on it that indicates where that specimen is. They don't tell the public where these sites are because they're of course worried about yahoos going down there and digging up whale skulls to put up on above the mantelpiece. Always a risk, trophy hunters. So there's a vague idea, you know, that yeah, I actually haven't visited them. I've seen photos, which have been shown to me by scientists, but I haven't gone in to check them out. And I think if you did, you'd just be standing in a clearing where there were little signs in the ground with numbers on them. But yeah, I mean, you know, what happens to a whale after death speaks to our attachment to them as well. The whale to cycle back to the whale that beached on the Perth beachfront, there was a debate about whether or not after it was dead, you know, should it be towed back out into the ocean to deteriorate and become, you know, the raft for a whole other bewitching menagerie of animals that form around whale bodies on the seafloor, or not. And because it was a large public beach, authorities were worried about sharks being attracted to the carcass and therefore deterring swimmers. But there was also kind of a biohazard of the flesh of the whale now that it had begun to decompose after it died. So they had to do, you know, the laws were such that they had to do a big cleanup. They had to take the whale body into landfill, and then they had to sift all the sand for any left detritus. Yeah, and they spent, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars in the cleanup after the whale died, treating it as a kind of biohazard.
Right.
Yeah, so that kind of tension between what is natural and what is not natural is yeah, it gets really sharp in that context. But for me, it was just kind of striking to think, well, this animal is going to be taken to the tip, and there it will, you know, amongst, in my mind, I was like, surely what between white goods and like old bags of trash, is there a whole whale in there? But anyhow, it does get incinerated before it's put into the trash. But yeah, wild to think about that.
Really wild. Yeah, it's much better to have whales die naturally. And your description of the whale fall and all the other life forms that live on it is so beautiful and moving. And that's what we all hope for, a natural death. Well, Rebecca, it's been fantastic speaking with you. Wonderful. I thank you so much. And I look forward to your next book.
Thank you, Donna. They were wonderful questions, and thank you to Daniel and to the others that will watch later. Javier, thank you so much for having me. It's such a thrill to get to talk to Exile in Bookville and to be a part of this. So yeah, I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. It was a fantastic conversation. It went by so quick, and I knew that you guys would have such a brilliant conversation about Fathoms. And once again, we do have copies of Fathoms. I didn't mean to cover up the pen and highlight
just highlight
Carnegie.
Carnegie.
I didn't mean to do that. Yeah, exactly. I did not mean to do that. Sorry, Pen. But yeah, we will have copies, and we'll have signed book plates from Rebecca. She'll send them when she can, and we'll mail them out to you if need be. And you can go to exileinbookville.com to purchase anything in print from us, but especially Fathoms by Rebecca James.
Makes a great gift. I've given it to friends and family.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, same here. It'll change lives. It really will. Seriously, it's an amazing book, and one that I will. And Donna and I talked about this during the process. I can pick it up, put it down, pick it up, put it down, and keep going back. And I feel like I'll do that as long as I live. Like I'll just keep going back to this book. So thank you so much, Rebecca. It was a pleasure to meet you. I was really nervous just because I'm such a huge fan, and it's too bad we couldn't have you here. But someday you'll come to Chicago, and we'll all hang out and have a good time. Yeah, exactly. For the next book, we'll have for the next book here in Chicago. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much.
And thanks everyone for tuning in. Thanks, Dan, for the great questions. And have
Dan.
a good night, everyone.
Take care. Stay well.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Good night.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care.